learning to be an ally for Indigenous peoples by researching to learn more about the history and continuing to support and act in meaningful ways.
Content warning. The following video contains material that may be harmful or traumatizing to some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. To be an ally is to actively support the struggle, speak up even when you feel scared, transfer the benefits of your privilege to those who have less, acknowledge that the conversation is not about you, acknowledging the fact that you are a guest on this land, recognizing that multiple nations exist, respecting any cultural protocols and traditions.
This is a partial history of the deconstruction of Indigenous people. In 1492, Christopher Columbus accidentally landed in the Americas with a crew of European explorers who referred to the entire Indigenous population as Indians, as they believed they had arrived in India. It is thought that 100 million Indigenous people lived in the Americas at the time of Christopher Columbus's arrival. By the end of the 19th century, between 90 and 99% of them were gone. Canada's Indigenous people were most affected by diseases brought by Europeans, including measles, smallpox, and influenza. European blades and guns killed Indigenous people, as well as factors associated with colonialism, large-scale land theft, forced relocations, and exhaustion of natural resources. Indigenous slaves constituted 2/3 of the slave population in Canada for roughly 150 years. A majority of Indigenous slaves in Canada were girls or young women, with the average age being 14 years old. Indigenous people were forbidden to perform traditional ceremonies including the sun dance and potlatch under the Indian Act. Religious leaders and government officials prohibited the possession of sacred objects such as totem poles, masks, and pipes. Many of these same individuals collected and sold them privately at lucrative prices. Indian Act sections restricting customs and culture were only removed in 1951 following an amendment.
Children growing up in impoverished conditions are in danger of perpetuating the cycle of poverty. In some provinces, over 60% of Indigenous children live in poverty. The child poverty rate among status First Nations children hovers around 50%. According to statistics from 2016, 28% of on-reserve First Nations people and 30% of Inuit in Canada lived in homes qualified as crowded. The basis for reporting overcrowding is that the number of people living in the home outnumber the number of rooms in the home. Compare this to non-Indigenous population, where the same rate is 4%. Indigenous peoples make up 14% of people using food banks in Canada, despite their low population numbers. Indigenous families make up 8% of Canada's population, but First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children are disproportionately more likely to be in foster care. 7.7% of all children under 14 in Canada are Indigenous, yet they make up 52.2% of children in foster care. Among non-Indigenous Canadians, the rate of education is always higher than it is for First Nation and Indigenous people. In addition, among educated First Nations and Indigenous people, the employment rate is lower than it is for non-Indigenous Canadians. For example, First Nation people who have a higher education are able to achieve a rate of only 71% employment, lower than the 80.9% reported for non-Indigenous people. The cause of this may be multifarious, including systematic racism and differences in cultural understanding. Indigenous people in Canada experience the highest levels of poverty. A shocking 1 in 4 Indigenous people, Aboriginal, Métis, and Inuit, or 25%, are living in poverty, and 4 in 10 or 40% of Canada's Indigenous children live in poverty. The suicide rate is 5 to 6 times higher for First Nations youth than non-Aboriginal youth, and 11 times higher for Inuit youth than the Canadian national average.
The purpose of residential schools was to educate and convert Indigenous youth and assimilate them into Canadian society. Over 130 residential schools operated in Canada, beginning in 1831. The last federally funded residential school closed in 1996. An estimated 150,000 First Nation, Inuit, and Métis children attended residential schools. Many students suffered abuse at residential schools. Impatience often led to excessive punishment, including physical abuse. In some cases, children were heavily beaten, chained, or confined. Due to poor record keeping by churches and federal government, it is unlikely that we will ever know the total loss of life that happened in residential schools. Experts estimate the number may be more than 6,000.
Indigenous women represent 10% of the total population of missing women in Canada. Between 2001 and 2014, the territories had a police-reported homicide rate for Indigenous women that was higher than the overall rate in Canada. Of the total solved homicide cases of Indigenous women between 1980 and 2014, 53% were committed by a family member, 26% by an acquaintance, and 8% by strangers. The 2014 homicide survey found that fewer homicides of Indigenous women occurred in a residence compared to non-Indigenous women. In addition, 17% of homicides of Indigenous women occurred on a street, a road, or a highway compared to 1% of non-Indigenous women, which led to the Red Dress movement to enhance awareness. Educating oneself is only half the work when being an ally. It is a lifelong process that is rooted in action and requires humility and ongoing critical self-reflection. Being an ally is not a badge of honor. It is a sign of privilege.